This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Lissa McClure, Executive Director of the Woodman Family Foundation, about the life and work of Francesca Woodman and her organization's new partnership with Gagosian Gallery to represent Woodman's work, beginning with an exhibition at Gagosian's 555 West 24th Street location in New York, which opens March 13th. In the conversation, Lissa discusses Woodman's prodigious work, her fondness for allegory, her fascination with surrealism, and the legacy that the organization is focused on preserving and growing. And now, a conversation all about Francesca Woodman with Lissa McClure. Lissa McClure, thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. Lissa, you're the Executive Director of the Woodman Family Foundation. And I want to speak with you this week because of the Woodman Family Foundation's new partnership with Gagosian to represent the work of Francesca Woodman. And, a lot of times I find it helpful to kind of start conversations with the hypothetical, which would be, in this case, something along the lines of, you sit down next to a perfect stranger at a dinner party, has no knowledge of who Francesca Woodman was or her work. Where do you start to describe it, its significance, and the work you do to protect her legacy?
That's a big dinner party question. And first of all, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think we sort of think of her as this preternaturally gifted young person who became a mature artist at a very young age, and had somehow a very, very full time of art making and production in a very shortened life. And that posthumously, although I'll get into later, I think she began her trajectory herself during her lifetime, but that her work just resonates with people. And I think important key curators saw the work very early on and championed it and understood that they were looking at something that was extraordinary. She was very committed to her medium. She was a real photographer. I think her content and her the visual language that she used is so compelling that people often sort of stop there because the images are so enthralling in a way, and there's a lot of the female body, and you could stop there, but there's so much more in terms of her intentionality and everything that she was trying to do in her photograph. She was a very serious artist starting at age 13. She considered herself an artist and acted as such. And from what I understand from friends and family, she sort of comported herself that way always from that age. And her life was really a living artwork in a way. Everything she did, everything she saw, everything she looked at, her friends, they were all part of her art and part of her process of making art. So she also came from a family of artists, so it was sort of they even said it was sort of the family religion. Her mother, Betty Woodman, was a sculptor who became very, very well known over the last decades of her life. Her father, George Woodman, began as an abstract painter in the 60s and 70s and then morphed into photography later. Her brother, Charles, a few years older than her, is a videographer and filmmaker. Video maker. So they were a family steeped in art. And I think those influences also had a huge impact on her becoming an artist and also the kind of artist she sort of became. I guess I'll just say briefly about the foundation. It's sort of this amazing confluence because we have not one, not two, but three artists that we represent. And I would say that Betty and George Woodman, because they were the stewards of Francesca's legacy since her death in 1981, understood quite well what that entailed and sort of the responsibilities of that. And I think they had to balance that with their own artwork and their own careers. So in 1994, they actually set up the foundation really quietly. It wasn't active, but I think they just understood what was going to be needed later for Francesca and for them. So we are now the sort of very lucky recipients of all of the artwork that all three of them left. They were all prolific, so it is voluminous what we now have in our inventory. And we also inherited all of their archives. So that has been, we'll get into this much later because we're culling those archives and we're finding so much amazing material that really helps broaden the understanding of all three of their work. And it's sort of this thrilling enterprise to be able to do that. And I think when we think about stewarding their legacies, using that material and also just getting their work out there and having it seen in new ways and from new perspectives is one of our big goals.
It makes me wonder, with her parents being artists, her passing was unexpected, right? Yeah. 22, 23 years old. There's the emotional turmoil of that event.
Grief, yeah.
Right. And when she passed, it was obvious the potential that she had and she was being recognized. But somebody had the forethought to protect her work. Because, we're talking about 13 years before the foundation was formed. Had things been kind of set aside in bankers' boxes, kind of awaiting the day when, if somebody was interested, it would be cataloged and registered. And I would love to learn about the other voices that kind of came alongside and said, her work exists beyond her lifetime, and we want to start including this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
First of all, this is such a great question. And I have to say, I don't think it's asked enough. I think there's sort of this big reputation and career that Francesca or that Woodman has now. And it's as if it just sort of, was birthed like Venus. It came out of nowhere. And I would say, so there's a lot to unpack in your question. I wish that it had been in bankers' boxes. That would have been super helpful. But it was not a chaotic mess. And I will say that Francesca started that. As I said before, she took herself very seriously as an artist. We have all of her journals, all of her notebooks, all of her sketchbooks. So we have a ton of material in Francesca's voice talking about everything from her daily life to her artistic aspirations and ideas for art making. And she was very cogent and clear that she wanted her work to be seen. And I think she kept it in such a way that she made it clear that her parents were to receive the work if she died, when she died. So her parents knew that they were meant to take care of it, but they also understood, I think, just implicitly because of Francesca's own determination and ambition, that was something that she wanted. I will say, I think there is a bit of a misconception that Betty and George sort of, after her death, in their grief, decided to go and try to get a huge career going for their daughter. And that's actually not the case. And it's interesting, we're in a great position because we're finally able to start doing that research. We just hired a researcher in addition to our curator this past year, and it's fantastic. But what we're finding is that Betty and George, and I think you were correct, Francesca died suddenly. It was a very tragic event for the family and friends and everyone. And her parents were grieving and in mourning. And so a few years went by, and then around 1984, the former director of the Wellesley Museum, Anne Gabhart, who is now one of our board members and a fantastic person, was visiting Betty and George. She actually knew Betty through the ceramic world. She took ceramic classes on the side. And she was visiting them, and they had some of Francesca's work on the wall, and Anne didn't know whose it was, and she wanted to know about this work. And then she learned it was Francesca's, and she asked if she could do a show. She felt especially the students at Wellesley would really respond, and Betty and George were hesitant. I don't think were quite ready for that, so she had to be pretty dogged in her pursuit of them. And then I think they agreed. And then a couple of pivotal, really important things happened. She brought in Roz Krauss, who had started October magazine a few years earlier and was already a hugely influential critic and art historian in New York. And then they co-curated this exhibition of over 100 prints that opened at Hunter College Museum, or Gallery, I should say. and then went to Wellesley and several other university museums around the country. And then they brought in Abigail Solomon Godot, an art historian, theory-based art historian. And Roz Krauss and Solomon Godot wrote these really, really critical, crucial early texts on Francesca's work. Krauss is a formalist approach, not wanting to get into anything identity-based, and Solomon Godot, much more theoretically based of her time. And I really think that just got the ball rolling. So my understanding is that a lot of people saw that work or heard about that work when it was at Hunter. Michael Brenson reviewed it in the New York Times in 1986. I mean, that's not nothing. And from there, the ball started to roll. Very soon thereafter, in 86, I think, or 87, Richard Flood, who was then to become, hugely influential curator, put her in a Memento Mori show that he did in Mexico City with a bunch of artists that were, Rosemary Truckle and Joel Peter Whitkin, Cindy Sherman, people like that. And then a year or so later, Adam Weinberg, as his former self as a curator at the Walker, put her in another really important group show that traveled. So to me, those are really key moments where once the work got shown, I think it was inescapable that it sort of commanded critical attention, and everything really grew from then. There was a show at the ISA Philadelphia in 1989, and then it just sort of went on from there. So she, and I think Betty and George probably struggled to keep up with it in a way, because they had their own work to do, and then there were all these requests for Francesca's work as well. So they hired people to help them with Francesca's sort of side of things. But I feel like it just built on itself. And I do really firmly believe it was based on the strength of the work. Although, as everyone said, there's this myth that sort of got created as well that I think it's my job to advocate. I don't think it's fair to put that kind of mythology of her death onto the work, because I think her work really spoke for itself.
You mentioned the formal analysis and, how the attraction to the work from the very beginning was just the quality of the formal elements in her work. But it's hard for people not to come to a show featuring Francesca's work and not be curious or attracted to her struggles. Is it difficult to navigate the balance between analyzing her work for what it is and that narrative of her struggle and her untimely passing, or are the two destined to always be intertwined?
I guess I would argue that they shouldn't be intertwined. And I think, as I just said, it's a bit of an unfair connection and reading. And I think it's funny, I guess it's a narrative. It has become a narrative around her death and maybe her psychology, but who wrote that narrative? Right. Not her, not people who knew her. It's this thing that came to life outside of her, and I sort of feel got put on her. And it's a very heavy weight to bear for an artist that was that young and with such a short career. But I also think that that sort of need to look at her work through the biographical lens really limits and is reductive in a way. It disallows for a more pure reading of the work itself. And I often wonder, if she were not young, if she were not beautiful, if she were not female, and if the same kind of dogged application of the biography of her life would be applied. There's some great male artists who died in a similar way, and obviously that's part of the narrative around their work, but certainly not all of it. They don't go back to day one and read everything through that lens. And so we're in this great position, and I guess this is part of the sort of thrilling part of what we get to do at the foundation, is because we have this archive. We know what she intended. We actually can read. I have some quotes that I wanted to share with you, just about her intentionality, about what she was trying to achieve in her work. And she was very steeped in art history, in literature, from the Victorians to Proust, Zola, Colette. I mean, she had a lot of outside influences, surrealism and classical architecture and art. And she was really interested in allegory and metaphor. She was really creating little mini narratives or faux narratives or scenes. And she would use herself or her friends, and she chose friends based on how they looked and if they fit for this particular scene that she envisioned. And then she photographed them. And so there's a lot that's missed if one wants to read the content of her photographs through the lens of her death, because you can, but disappearing doesn't mean a foreshadowing of death, right? There's a whole concept of motion in the body and space and how it moves that she was interested in the body. So I think those are I think one of our raisons d'etre is to kind of disentangle those two, and not to disavow or try to gloss over the biographical realities, but just kind of bring down a notch or two the volume, I guess, and let some other things have a bit of a voice. And we're also really eager to just give her some agency and let Woodman kind of speak for herself. I'm just going to read you a quote that she was writing sort of a back and forth interview with an Italian writer in 1979. And she said, "My early interest in literature followed me to art school, and the greatest influences on my work have been the writings of André Breton, specifically Nadia, which is composed of some rather random photographs that are expanded into the plot of the story. Colette and Zola also. I feel that photographs can either document and record reality, or they can offer images as alternative to everyday life, places for the viewer to dream in. In college, I became more involved with the second sort of image, first in the form of tiny, thus private picture stories." I mean, that is not a young woman,
Right.
Trying to figure out her identity or, in a
Right.
photograph. It's purposeful. And it's, I think it just does a disservice to not allow her intentionality in. So we get to do that, which is, fantastic.
In the preparation for these sorts of discussions, I try to take a deeper dive than what my existing knowledge was. And I think that was the thing that really struck me as I dove deeper. I guess I had the assumption that her work was coming from a place of personal struggle and reflecting her identity, because so many artists that is the source of their work, right? But the more I read, the more I looked, the more I heard her talk about it, the more I heard art historians talk about it. She really was approaching that. She was inserting herself into her work, but it was almost like she was inserting herself because so often, it's easier. Why did you make a self-portrait? Well, I didn't have a model available. It's like exactly. It's a matter of convenience that she knew exactly what she wanted and she could go stand there and do it. Right. Yep. But all these things are coming from places of allegory and just really a serious knowledge of art history in placing herself in that context.
Yes, and wanting to be part of that sort of trajectory, and inserting herself and thinking of herself as such, and having a confidence, ambition to want to be that and to have a voice in that kind of lineage. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot of people say when they view Francesca's work, that I think a lot of times they use the word timeless, that it's sort of, if you come to the work without knowing who or when or where, it's hard to put a finger on exactly when it was created, where it was created. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with photographer Mona Kuhn last year, who exclusively photographs nudes. And we discussed how the removal of clothing does a lot of things. But most importantly, in Kuhn's perspective, it removes reference to time, and it allows the work to exist outside of a time frame because you're removing all those references to fashion and fad. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Woodman was keenly interested in a timeless quality. I mean, she wrote about it a lot. A lot of the books she read were about that. She dressed that way in vintage clothing. She considers herself much more aligned with the Victorian era than her own. So I think personally, she felt, and this could be because she grew up spending so much time in Italy with her family and going to all sorts of museums. I mean, she's just so steeped in sort of cultural, art historical history that might make one feel a little out of step with, 1978 Americana. So she definitely was very interested in timelessness, but she also had a really interesting perspective on the nude because she was really coming at it as a classical form. And I think that's another maybe misconception that people think it was her nude body to sort of try to self-analyze or figure something out. And I'm not saying she was a young woman. I'm not saying that was not there. I mean, I can't and wouldn't say that, but she was so accustomed to seeing the nude in art that it was just something that was second nature to her. And I have another quote for you, but I just think it's such a great one. She's talking about nude. She says, I use nudes partly in an ironic sense, like classical painting nudes. I want my pictures to have a certain timeless, personal, but allegorical quality like they do in, say, Ang history paintings. But I like the rough edge that photography gives a nude. I like watching the immediacy of a photograph struggle with timeless imagery the way it does in, say, a pictorialist photograph. I mean, isn't that like it's just so succinct? She knew what she was doing. And I think she even had, she had this predilection for crumbling, dilapidated interiors that I think also really sort of enhanced this feeling of timelessness in her photographs. But then, she also was really invested and interested in the clothed body. And I think that goes back to classical references because it was often draped, her vintage pattern dresses from the thrift stores draped as if, the models were classical sculptures. And then sometimes just as themselves, or you would get the 70s when you saw pictures of Francesca's knee socks and her Mary Janes that she bought in Chinatown. So there was she had a lot of range in terms of even costuming, if you will. It's probably not the right word, in how she used clothing as well on the figure. So that's definitely true.
Dilapidated interiors. I've even listened to a talk that an art historian gave on. He spoke 20 minutes about her affinity for photographing corners. How she would.
Yes.
Which was really interesting and something that kind of also placed her in 20th century surrealist aesthetics, that there was a long history of people kind of exploring what happens in a corner.
Well, I think she came at it twofold. I think definitely the surrealist influence. She spent a year living in Rome in 77 and 78 with the RISD honors program. I mean, she had been to Italy for much of her life already. But when she was there, she found, I mean, I'm sure you know this, but your listeners may not. She found a surrealist bookstore named the Maldoror, and she befriended the two owners who were a bit older than she was. And they had a circle of artist friends that she befriended, and this became her community there. So she was sort of there to be in college, and she was actually hanging out with these older Italian artists. She had a studio in the pasta factory. They had studios in the pasta factory. She shot many of the works, with the dilapidated walls in that pasta factory. So she definitely was steeped in surrealist literature and understood that very well. I think it's interesting because one of the angles, no pun intended, at all, of the Gagosian exhibition is this idea of architecture and classical proportions, and how that then sort of you can read that in other works where she's dealing with interiors and corners and doorways and hallways and windows, and kind of this idea of a body in space, almost a body as sculpture, and how it is, or architecture, and how it is organized into space and how it operates in space. So I don't know if I could talk for 20 minutes on the corners, which I want to know who that was, but it's super interesting. So it's almost this multifaceted approach. She's using so many influences and a range of knowledge that she's bringing to these works.
The way you describe it also makes me think of the Greeks' real fascination with the ideal and, the golden ratio, how they would see it in human form, but also in their architecture. And of course, that kind of leads the conversation to her work with the diazotypes, like Blueprint for a Temple, and the work that she was doing that was tied to architecture and kind of a Greek antiquity sort of feel, using this experimental materials. Can you kind of talk about that because that's a bit of a departure?
It's a huge departure. And she actually talked about that. Again, we have all this great material that we get to read and sort of share. But she talked about in the fall of 79, she was in New York, and she started in her journals and in her notebooks making sketches and notes about constructing a Greek temple. And she wanted to go large scale, and she wrote about how her earlier works had, gelatin silver prints, and the sort of small, intimate scale was sort of the opposite of what she was thinking of doing now, which was this, I will say, grand and monumental scale. And instead of being sort of intimate, they were universal. And it went from maybe allegory and metaphor in a certain extent to this sort of universality of this vocabulary, architectural vocabulary. And so she wanted to go large, and she was a young woman who had day jobs and no money and was living in the East Village. And so she needed to find a cheap way to try to pull this off. And so she came upon architectural blueprint paper, and I think made the decision because she had a friend who worked at a printer that printed for architects, and the friend let her in after hours to print for free. And so she was always one looking for a bargain in that way. And so this worked really well for her. But she also talks about a pivot from the crispness of her photographs to this more ephemeral and ethereal effect that she could get with the diazotypes. So I'm going to say just briefly how they're made, because
Sure.
I didn't know, and it's kind of interesting. But she essentially takes a photograph, one of her photographs, the negative, and projects it onto a large piece of this blueprint paper that's on the wall. And it's a very long, slow exposure. So it's hours for the image to imprint, and then it goes to be processed, and then she got it back. So she decided to make some nudes and some female figures that were the caryatids. So it was really all of her multiple trips to Athens as a kid, sometimes maybe wanting to be there and sometimes not. She sort of wanted to create her own Porch of the Maidens and her own Greek temple. So she got her friends to pose for her, and she draped them in her clothing. So it looks like it's, ancient, Greek and Roman folded drapery, but it's actually, one of them, I believe, is this sweater set her mother bought her to go on job interviews in. And so she had all these images of the caryatids. Some of them she kept as just single large images. And by large, I mean maybe 80 inches tall by 30 or 4 inches wide, 40 inches wide. And we'll show 3 of those in the Gagosian exhibition. But then she really decided to make these 2 monumental temples. So one is, I think, 5 caryatids, and the full temple. She decided it's almost like the extreme of high-low. She was sort of going after this sort of iconic bastion of Western culture that can't be erased, these Greek temples, right? And she decides to make them of a collage of torn diazotype elements that are super fragile and could disintegrate. And so she's really playing, I think, on the sort of the difference there and making it her own. And so she decided to recreate the pediment and the frieze and the steps from the tile patterns from her friends' crummy New York City bathrooms. So she went around and photographed these tile patterns, which you would never know. You're looking at this piece and it's this beautiful mosaic, but it is from some crummy New York City bathroom. And she probably used the same friends as models for the caryatids for these works. So, so the piece that we're showing at Gagosian, she actually showed, and I guess I didn't say this early on about what she sort of did to get her own career going. In 1980, she was in 2 group exhibitions at Daniel Wolf, his gallery, which was already important, and he came to be even more important later. And she was also included in a group show at the Alternative Museum in New York, which is no longer in existence. And what she showed in the Alternative Museum was this blueprint for a temple. And it's the one that we have. So the other, which we call number 1, is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum and has been since 2000. We, during the bequest, we realized that we had this other temple that had been literally rolled up since she rolled it up after she took it down, and her father helped her carry it in the subway home. And so it is 14 feet tall by 10.5 feet wide. Wow. The figures are life size, and it's this beautiful purpley blue diazotype color. Some she did in a brown, more sepia. So that is the sort of subject matter. And she talks about how she lived in Italy for so long, and she was so steeped in Italian culture and art history for so long, but somehow when she came back to New York, that's when it really congealed for her, and she had this idea to make this this element. So it literally was, she would tear, and I mean herself, tear different strips. So there are 24 diazotype elements in this piece, and they're all different sizes, but some very, very large. She stapled them together or taped them, probably with masking tape. We have her cat Anchovy's paw prints on some of them, which we had to keep because it's just so charming. She was working on them on the floor in her studio. But it is this massive monumental pivot in her career, in her art making as well. And we think it really signals a very major shift in how she how she considered herself and what she wanted to say artistically. I think she really made the distinction from the more personal images to doing something much more universal. And so we're super excited because the show, you see this temple when you walk in, and it is, I can say this subjectively, I think, it's pretty magnificent. But then we've also sort of constructed the rest of the show, which is mostly gelatin and silver prints. Once you start with that knowledge, you can go back and see that all she was doing in many of the photographs that you know had a lot of the same concerns. She was thinking about architecture, and she was thinking about spaces, and she was thinking about the body as a sculpture, and she talks about that as well. So there's almost like the body is a sculpture, or it's in the case of the caryatids, the body is performing architecture in a certain way. It's all super interesting.
Blueprint paper isn't necessarily intended to be archival, right? I mean, it's a working material, right?
Yep.
And so are you guys being faced with some real conservation issues, given something that may be more closely akin to newsprint than what we typically think of as like these really long-lasting materials? I mean, are there headaches there?
It's funny, headaches, the best kind, maybe, like the most gratifying headaches. We've been working actually with the Better Image with Peter Mastardo and Nancy Reinhold, who they could probably speak more to the headaches, but they've also spoken to sort of the joy of helping this piece come back to life. Although I have to say, because this piece had been rolled up, all these elements had been rolled up for 40 years, it was in extremely good condition. But the paper is very light sensitive, so you have to be super careful with light levels. These works can't be out in full light for years at a time. They're kind of the opposite of gelatin silver prints that way. But it's not impossible by any means. So all we did was they would, if there were where Francesca had torn, if a little edge was going to continue tearing, they would gently, and everything we did was reversible. They would stabilize that. There were little bits of loss of the pigment around where she had taped or stapled that they would, color in with a colored pencil again that can be reversed. So we didn't have to do anything major. And it is just a matter of the care for it. You just have to be mindful of the material, but it's not, maybe it's not quite as much of a headache as one might imagine, I guess I would say. And the Met has shown they conserve theirs in-house a little over 10 years ago, and they've shown it once, and I think they'll probably show it again. So it's and the single caryatids, there are some out in the world, and have been for a while, and they get shown in exhibitions and things. So it's not quite as tricky as maybe one would think.
How did the partnership with the foundation and Gagosian come about? Can you talk a little bit about the shared vision that you guys have, and maybe the goals that you've established for the collaboration, and what are the goals for the future? I mean, is it purely educational, inspirational? I assume that there's a mission statement for the foundation, and there's probably some sort of mission statement for how you guys are going to work with someone like Gagosian, right?
We don't have a mission statement with them, but they're definitely on board and real partners with our sort of mission and our goals. I mean, I think that's one thing that we feel really fortunate about, is we're very aligned in terms of how we view sort of the next steps that need to be taken on Woodman's behalf. So the foundation sort of got going in earnest upon Betty Woodman and George Woodman's death. Betty died most recently in early 2018. And so it took a little while for that estate to settle, and all of the artwork to be transferred, and the archival material to be transferred. And once we sort of had all of that bequest taken care of, a couple of things happened. One is, we had come to understand that during their lifetimes, Betty and George at a certain point just put a great deal of lifetime material aside, and it was for the future foundation. So they did sell quite a few lifetime prints over those 20 years, but at a certain point, they really sort of drew down the gauntlet. And so there's all this material. They kept the best print of every image, so we have that. But in addition to that, we also have a great number of works that no one has ever seen, because the way the trajectory of Francesca's career, Woodman's career, sort of played out is that a curator early on had access and chose, let's say, 100 images, and then there's a catalog, and then the next curators see that catalog and they choose from the same images. So it's a pretty limited number of works that are sort of out there. Maybe 150 are really sort of widely seen. And what we found, one of the really exciting things that we found looking through every print now, which I am so grateful to have done, is that Francesca worked serially a lot more than anyone realizes. And there are, the iconic images that and then they have these siblings that were sort of shot before and after. And when you see them in sequence, A, you read them differently, but B, you understand more about her thinking and her intentionality again. So it changes the conversation about her work. So we were very keen to sort of have a pivot at this point, because there is so much that's different, in terms of what we're going to do going forward as the foundation, as the stewards of her legacy. So there was a really long and very, very fruitful and positive relationship with Marian Goodman Gallery that, we are all on good terms, and, very grateful for that. But it just seemed as if Gagosian had a broader reach and a global reach, and also really shared our vision and our belief that there had been limitations on how the work had been seen, and that it needed to be mindfully shared in very thoughtful ways in order to sort of slowly make that apparent and allow for new scholarship and new perspective on the work. And you can't really do that unless you're sort of making conscious decisions to show it differently. So we were super excited that they were on board. We work with Mark Francis and Putri Tan, who have been amazing partners, and also just really share that vision. And I mean, an example of that is for this show that's opening in 2 weeks somehow. They commissioned a classics scholar from Princeton named Brooke Holmes, who is amazing, to write the essay. And we had a meeting with her yesterday, and her ideas are so fascinating and so inspired in a way, and also off the beaten path in a way. They're not steeped in the art historical sort of rhetoric that has gotten us where we are in terms of the scholarship. So it's those kinds of things are just things that the gallery is also very interested in, and not only interested in, can facilitate. And so we feel just really happy to be in partnership with them going forward.
When you talk about those lifetime prints, I mean, it sounds so fortuitous that there are so many, because I had conversation before with a biographer, and Vivian Meyer, and the whole notion of finding this, thousands of undeveloped rolls of film in the photography world, that's actually rather problematic, because what you see in the lens is only half of the artwork. The other half is in the dark room making choices about where do I crop, how much do I burn. And so,
Exactly.
Having those lifetime prints as finished pieces, it's really fortuitous that there are so many more there than we anticipated, rather than, just simply negatives in a shoebox, right?
Well, the negative, I mean, it would be so it would be so much more problematic if we didn't have them, because we're not printing anything from negatives. We're so committed to Woodman's choice making, just as you described. That's exactly it. And she made so many choices in the darkroom, and even printed different prints of the same image that are radically different because of different effects she was trying to achieve, and how well she did that. And she also edited her own work. I mean, we have what she kept, and she kept what she wanted to keep. There were a lot that were on the floor of her studio, very famously, that classmates have. But those were sort of her rejected prints. So she kept the ones that she felt strongly about, and that's what we get to work with. So we do not, we don't want to do anything posthumously, and we don't need to. And our mission, if part of that is to sort of steward and shepherd and place these prints as best we can. Many institutionally, that's part of our goal, just to make sure she's represented fully enough in a number of institutions. But there are some that will be able to, go out into the world. And we, Betty and George Woodman, stopped lending lifetime prints for exhibitions quite some time ago, and so there are exhibition prints made from her originals that are used for that, and that's what we'll continue to do as well. We have a couple, we make rare exceptions, one of which is coming soon. But yeah, so we still have the ability to make exhibitions institutionally with any images that are requested, but the lifetime prints, we get to treat and sort of privilege now, which is really exciting.
Sure. So the first exhibit with Gagosian is coming up soon. When is that? What are the details? And
March 13th.
Oh my gosh.
2 weeks from yesterday. We start installing on Monday. So I think it's 70 works. It has this blueprint for a temple that we've just talked about, 3 large single caryatids, which are gorgeous, and then I guess 60 something gelatin silver prints. And some of them are very well known. Some of them you will know well and have seen. Others people will never have seen. And then we are also including a fair number of these sort of groupings of works where she was working serially, so that people can get an understanding of how she was thinking when she was actually making these works, and how she conceived of them. So,
are we thinking about books also?
Artist books or catalog for the show?
Yeah, either, both.
Well, we're definitely doing a catalog for the show, which will be great, with this classical scholars essay that I just mentioned, Brooke. Her artist books, that's another really interesting aspect of her work, which we were fortunate to work with a publisher, Mac, out of London last year, who published a monograph, which is all 8 of the artist books that Francesca ever made, 2 of which were previously unknown. We found them in the archive, which is another great thing about having access to this archive. And that's another really interesting way to understand Francesca's, especially the sort of narrative process and this whole Bretonian sort of playing with found text and her images, sort of the inversion of what he did in Nadia with his text and found images, this sort of banal combination. And so the monograph came out last spring, and MAC is also making a limited special edition where they're being reproduced one-to-one as individual books, hand sewn, hand torn. I mean, it's really quite an endeavor, but it's fantastic because these books are so fragile. She made them on found notebooks, mostly that she bought at flea markets in Rome in the 70s. Have you seen something?
I'd seen something where it was like she had deconstructed and reconstructed like a geometry textbook.
Yeah, that was the one. She actually she made that, and it was produced during her lifetime. It actually came out right after her death, but she worked on it and completed it before her death. It's called Some Disordered Interior Geometries. And yes, you've seen that book. So this volume includes that and 7 others. And they're incredibly rich and interesting. And some of the images exist as prints that people have seen or can see. Some do not. They only exist in these books. She ended up, we believe it's the last 2 books that she made with transparencies so that you could see the text of the book underneath her image. And we were wondering yesterday about whether or not that sort of directly led to making the projected, making diazotypes from projections as another way of sort of pushing her medium and pushing her process. It's all fascinating.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I've had so much fun talking, Lissa.
Thank you. Me too.
And so, so the exhibit is coming up in just a couple of weeks, March 13th at Gagosian. Mm-hmm. I can't say thank you enough for your time. And I hope that we've piqued people's interest and that they'll come out and view the work or just take time to, visit the foundation site.
Please.
Where's the best place to find the Woodman Family Foundation online?
WoodmanFoundation.org. That's our website, www.woodmanfoundation.org. And we also literally just this week have moved into our new office space where we will house our archive, which will become a study center hopefully within the next year or so. So coming soon on 23rd Street will be access to that.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.